Well, thank you very much for having me, Mette. So yes, I mean, what we saw in the last few weeks is an escalation of the repression by the government of Daniel Ortega, which basically coincided with the start of the electoral process. In May, the government carried out a superficial electoral reform, basically just including in the electoral law a set of repressive laws that were passed at the end of last year, including the Foreign Agents Law, which basically mandates every organization or person who receives money from abroad to register as a foreign agent, along the lines of a Russian model law. Another one called the Law of National Sovereignty and Rights of the People and things like that, which basically considers a traitor to the motherland anyone who somehow advocate for foreign intervention, including, just saying, the international community should put more pressure on Ortega. That's, for example, a justification for violating this law and being detained. And the third one, which is the cybercrime law, which punishes with prison those who produce or spread fake news without much defining what a fake news is and who is going to define a fake or true news. And so these set of laws were included in the electoral law. Coupled with that, the government appointed a new Supreme Electoral Council, fully controlled by the Sandinistas, which is the ruling party, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or National Liberation Sandinista Front. And basically, since then, the government has escalated its attempts to hinder the opposition's participations in the elections by opening cases against, first of all, opposition's pre-candidates. The opposition didn't have a defined candidate yet. There's a time until end of July to present a candidate. And the opposition was divided into two blocks, which over the last year and a half didn't manage to basically coalition and band together to form a united front against Ortega. So they didn't have a defined candidate, but there were many pre-candidates, and they started opening up cases against some of these pre-candidates, 4 so far, and detained them. Alongside with candidates, they started also harassing other political and business figures of a high level. So basically at this point, we have around 4 pre-candidates, 2 workers of a foundation that was led by one of the pre-candidates, Cristiana Chamorro, and 10 political figures and business figures, which are very known in the country, plus 3 who are wanted, basically 3 business people who are wanted and on the run or hiding, basically, in the country. So there's basically a witch hunt that's been unleashed by the government to try and quell dissent and impede that the opposition managed to form a united front and create an alternative ahead of the elections. This escalation is something that maybe many didn't foresee, but it's intimately related with what happened in 2018, because Ortega is not the first time he tries to meddle with elections. He has, he was first, of course, directed the Junta de Gobierno after the revolution in 1979, then won the first elections in 1984, then lost power in 1990. And only regained it in 2006. And since then, he's been in the presidency. And since then, he's accumulated power and control over various state institutions, in the electoral bodies, in the judicial bodies, the security forces, of course. and has meddled with the elections, cancelling the legal status of some opposition parties, fueling divisions within opposition representatives, buying in some of the some politicians, etc. But this time, he managed basically to get away with it in previous elections because he could count on the support of the private sector, with which he had installed a model called of dialogue and consensus. So basically, just divide roles and basically not meddle with the economy, so that the capital, that the business people would be happy while he was carrying out his thing politically, and with the Catholic Church as well, and of course he had a high rate of public approval because the country eventually, through this model, was narrowing the democratic pluralism, but at the same time it was having a development rate. I mean, the economy was growing at quite high speed, so people were happy eventually. The thing is that this accumulation of power particularly affected the youngsters who did not find space in the society, which was controlled by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which is composed of, in its leadership, by people that are very old now, because the revolution was like already more than 40 years ago. And these narrowing spaces basically function as a steamer in the society, which just needed a trigger to basically manifest. And the trigger was 2018, where, first of all, a law that was proposed by Vice President Rosario Murillo, Ortega's wife, to limit the use of social media it's basically like a censorship of social media. It started to create discontent in that regard. Then there was a wildfire in the Indio Maiz reserve that was really badly handled by the government, which also caused outcry in the country. And eventually, there was a reform to the Social Security Institute, which basically increased businesses and Jubilee's contributions and decreased basically the pensions. And that was the chispa, the trigger. The old people started to protest, and they were heavily repressed by the government, and that caused all the youngsters in universities, students, movements, etc., to join the protests, which were eventually cracked down as well. So basically, various sectors of the society started to join, translating into mass protests of like marches of even hundreds of thousands of people, really massive, that eventually were cracked down by police forces and para-police forces, leaving more than 300 dead, and forcing dozens of thousands to flee the country. So since then, that was a watershed in the country's recent history. Ortega lost the support of the private sector, lost the support of the Catholic Church. His popularity rates fell by a half. So these elections represent a greater risk for him to lose power, because he cannot count on these three areas of great support. And that's why I think he's not only using the tools that are in his usual repertoire, like canceling the status of political parties, etc., but even going after basically physically and harassing and detaining opponents. We'll talk probably about it later, but we came out with a report around mid-May exactly to underline and not to flag basically the fact that Nicaragua had slipped out of the international radar, because after 2018 and the government crackdown on protest, Ortega managed basically to retake control of the country, install a sort of a de facto police state. There were no protests at all in the last couple of years. But the crisis, the grievances that brought to the protests to erupt, and the grievances that were created by the crackdown, the grief, etc., had not been addressed. So this electoral process for us represented a clear raised alarm bells. And unfortunately, the U.S. with this new Biden administration, of course, first of all, had some problems of transition, as we know, with what happened with Trump, etc. Secondly, of course, it focused its attention on the so-called Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, due to the surge in arrivals at the southern border. And actually, Nicaraguans don't make up for much about the population that arrives to the U.S. They usually go to Costa Rica, or if they can, they just fly to Miami or other parts of the U.S. So focusing this attention on that part of Central America, and seeing Nicaragua as a sort of relatively stable, nothing really happening, delayed the response of the international community, which I think the U.S. has now realized quite evidently that there is a problem. It's not the only one in Central America. There are, of course, other issues. There are very problematic relations with El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, with one Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, who's been accused of participating in drug trafficking activities, basically. And there's Nicaragua as well, which, of course, doesn't help the stabilization of the region. I think what is being done now, possibly a bit late, but at least it's positive, is a greater engagement with with basically regional governments in Central America and in Latin America. The OAS has recently passed a resolution condemning these deeds, which obtained the greatest number of votes of any resolution passed in the last 3 years on Nicaragua, 26. And basically, I see an attempt to coordinate the response. Of course, statement, condemnation, some also targeted sanctions were imposed on some officials. This is not a drastic change of recipe towards what's been done in the last 3 years, and we've not seen so much these great results of this kind of strategy so far. Ortega is still there and is actually escalating its repressive tactics ahead of the elections. So far, since basically mid-2018, the U.S. has sanctioned around 30 Nicaraguan officials and I think 6 or 7 entities, including the national police as a whole institution, and other banks and other entities. And basically, what we saw is that if at the beginning there could have been some sort of push, since they were new to Ortega, and so at the beginning possibly they helped between late 2018 and early 2019 to reopen a space to press Ortega into, for example, resuming talks with the opposition. Because something I didn't mention is that in this crisis, the government and opposition groups like this hybrid organizations that basically were formed out of the protest of 2018, which include the business sector, academia, students' organizations, social movements, some political representatives, etc., called the Civic Alliance, sat down twice to try and find a negotiated solution to the crisis. One was really when the protests were at their highest point, And the second one was at the beginning, end of February, March 2019. So in that case, possibly the initial sanctions started, may have pressed Ortega or contributed to press Ortega into concede a second round of talks, which, for example, contributed to the release of hundreds of political prisoners who were detained in the protest and basically just for having participated in the process. But since then, since the end of the second round of talks, the Trump administration had imposed, recurrent cumulative rounds of sanctions to Nicaraguan officials, to the military, to the police, to Congress, etc., with the hope possibly of basically breaking the Sandinista ranks, making some allies of Ortega to, withdraw their support to the government. And that didn't happen. And actually, the opposite was created. The government entrenched itself in a position of strengthened anti-imperialist rhetoric against the foreign interference with domestic affairs, etc., and basically radicalized its way of also looking inward at the domestic level, and we are seeing it right now with this radicalization of the tensions and harassment, etc. So we believe that sanctions can be a tool, but if accompanied by other diplomatic engagement tools, and particularly at this moment when everyone is thinking, okay, let's suspend Nicaragua from the CAFTA, the free trade agreement between the US and Central America, or the association agreement between the EU and Central America. So broader sanctions that would actually have a great impact on the second poorest Latin American country. We believe that there should be first an attempt to try and engage with the government and try and see if the negotiated solution and actually a lifting of sanctions could be thought in exchange for moves towards releasing these political prisoners or creating the conditions for a minimally fair and transparent election. Well, if things continue this way, you don't have anyone challenging Ortega in the next elections, because all the main pre-candidates are being detained. Particularly Cristiana Chamorro was the first pre-candidate who was detained. She's the daughter of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who was the one who actually defeated Ortega in 1990 for the first time. So she carries this symbolical weight of being the daughter of someone who beat Ortega. And that's why she went first, actually. But all the most relevant pre-candidates, or many of the most relevant pre-candidates, have been detained. There have been also cases opened against around 30 between journalists, media owner, etc. So we're looking into a scenario in which basically these next elections are going to be sort of a black box with no international observation, possibly not even local media observation, because I fear that the media are going to come next, closer to the election. Not even international media observation, as I don't know if you saw it, but the New York Times correspondent was denied entry to the country yesterday. So we're looking at basically a scenario in which Ortega wants to isolate the country completely, shut it down, and up until the election, and then reopen it as it could function. So if things continue this way, the possibility for free elections are definitely below zero. If there's any change in Ortega's attitude, but I think that will require a lot of effort between the national and foreign actors that are participating in this process, there could be a minimally fair elections. But a full, fair and transparent election is anyway impossible, because the electoral reforms that were requested, demanded by national and international actors have not been met. International observation has not been invited yet, and it's actually been downgraded to accompaniment. The Supreme Electoral Council is completely controlled, organizes the electoral process, count the votes, transmit the results, is completely controlled by the government, by the ruling party. So the conditions are still already there for not having a fair election. So if we continue to see this path of actually also repression and escalation of repression, it's really hard to believe that there would be any condition for anyone to run against Ortega at some point.